My journaling and marginalia practice has allowed me to converse with the greatest minds in history. When life has descended into chaos, it is my reciting and relishing of great literature, and it is the writing in the margins of my favourite books and putting ink to paper that has provided me with a life-saving light. My journal has been my comfort and my constant companion. And today I would like to walk you through how I journal, how I do marginalia, my philosophy behind it, and a recommended approach for you to try out. Now let's talk practicalities and let's talk marginalia, because a good journaling practice begins with marginalia, in much the same way that a good morning routine begins the night before. There's lots of talk about morning routines. It's a very sexy thing to talk about, but I think evening routines are more important. Our day begins in a powerful way the night before, and our journaling begins in the margins of our books. Now, if you've never stained the pages of your books, if you've never put ink to paper, then the prospect of marginalia can be rather daunting. I remember the first time I started doing marginalia, it felt as though I was doing something wrong, something naughty, like I was blaspheming against the writer. But indeed, one mindset that helped me overcome this was the idea that writing in the margins, underlining things, circling things, writing my own notes is the highest compliment you can pay to that writer. And indeed, if you put yourself in the writer's shoes, which reader would you feel more grateful for, more thankful for, more flattered by? The reader who keeps the book pristine, doesn't dog-ear it, doesn't crack the spine, doesn't write in it, and then pops it back on the shelf, hardly ruffled, or the reader who covers it in their ink? That's a high compliment, because that person is saying that you have put together something that is worth working over, worth taking seriously, worth committing to memory, worth wrestling with. That's a high compliment. Now, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to my favourite books, I have multiple copies. I have show copies and I have work copies. If the book is my favourite book, then of course I'm going to want to check out new editions, illustrated editions, editions with new introductions, rare editions, but you also want to have an old paperback that you can beat up and use to put your thoughts in the margins. This is my work copy for Moby Dick. I have several beautiful copies of Moby Dick. I have an old Everyman's Library edition that I wouldn't dream of marking. My Library of America editions are very, very beautiful. You can see I have a Lauren Isley behind me. I wouldn't dream of marking the page in this book in particular. Having said that, however, I do have a Library of America edition of Emerson's essays, and that is one of my most beaten up, dog-eared and stained books. I picked that one up secondhand. It didn't have its dust jacket, it was nude, and so I thought, why not? And now it is like a little piece of me. It's an externalization of my soul. And I really do cherish the work copies, even more than the show copies. The show copies are nice, they're fun to rifle through, they're fun to show off to people, but it's the work copies that mean a lot to me. And if somebody got their hands on my work copies, they would have their hands on my soul at a moment in time, a little piece of me. Now, I understand the prospect of marking your books might feel a little bit daunting. A good way to get over that, however, is to begin small. Begin with a short story and do what Michel de Montaigne did. Montaigne, who was a very, very good reader, a deep reader, as you might expect from the father of the personal essay. Montaigne would reach the end of a work and he would date it. Right at the end, he'd put the date and he would write a synopsis of sorts, 1 or 2 sentences, maybe 3, where he would try to summarise not only what the book was about, but how he felt about it as well. This is a really good way to get started with marginalia. Pick a short story. Treat yourself to an old, battered, maybe even second-hand copy of a book of short stories. Get a Wordsworth Paperbacks Classics edition and read through your short story. Date it at the end and do a synopsis. That's how you get started. The next stage to marginalia is simply underlining things, circling things. And you might wonder, what do I underline? What's important enough? Well, the answer is anything that resonates with you for any reason. Yeah, the fun with imaginative literature, and the reason why I have always found it so rewarding, is how subjective it is. Yes, there are objective markers of aesthetic accomplishment, and even with something like symbolism, we can say, well, by virtue of the symbolism appearing at this part in the book, or because it's introduced with this character, then it has to mean this. Despite there being objectivity in great art, I love the subjectivity because it is a mirror, it is reflective, and Carl Jung told us that the only one who can interpret a dream is the dreamer. He told his students to dispense with their dream dictionaries. Once they learned everything there was to know about symbolism, it was time to throw all of that out. It's about what it means to you. And when it comes to Marginalia, it's all about what resonates with you right now for any reason. But what are some reasons why I might underline something or circle something? Musicality. I might just love the phrasing, the way it sounds. Poignance, or if I find something that's profound, if I think, whoa, I want to sit with that, I want to return to that. Very often my underlinings are a note to my future self to spend more time disproportionately with that quote, maybe even learn it, paraphrase it. And sometimes I will see recurring themes and I will jot in the margins the other pages where I've noticed a similar theme. And this is an extraordinary way to bring some unity to an expansive work like Moby Dick, like War and Peace. And so looking through my marginalia for Moby Dick, as you may know, Moby Dick begins with some etymology, it begins with some extracts. Melville gave us a procession of quotations about whales. Later in the book he would give us a procession of biological encyclopedia entries around whales and marine life. But you can see in my jottings in the margin, I'm posing questions. This is something that I like to do. I like to pose questions because our marginalia is something we return to, and we will answer those questions when we journal in more depth. And if we pose that question, we do not need an answer, but our unconscious will start to work on an answer. As Rilke taught us, learn to love the questions. You can see I'm asking, there's a procession of different etymologies for the word whale, and I have taken it that because Moby Dick is a quest narrative, all of this can be a stand-in for what we are going through in our lives, our personal hero's journey. And so I have asked myself, well, what is your whale? And I am prompting myself here in the margins to uncover the etymology of my quest, my whale, because our ancestors have gifted us wisdom. It's embedded in the words we use every day, and we can go on an etymological excavation. We can look up where the words we use without thinking come from, and so we can get to better know our subject matter by understanding how those who went before us thought. Where do the words come from? Because all words are sign, they're all symbol, they're all figurative to some degree, they all represent something. So where did this sign come from? That's a really interesting thing to think about. And you can see here, I've asked another question when we get to the extracts. Moby Dick begins with an extract from Genesis, and God created great whales. And then we get to Job, Leviathan maketh a path to shine after him. Then Jonah, and we go through and we see the Psalms, we see Milton, we see Shakespeare, of course. And I have simply asked myself, well, what is the effect of flipping through these? Yeah? Because a lot of readers will skip the extracts. They want to go straight to Loomings, chapter 1. Call me Ishmael, let's get into the story. But Melville put these extracts here, and an overwhelming amount of them, to create the effect of the Leviathan looming on the horizon. And so that insight arises from a simple question. What's the effect here? And I encourage you to embrace difficulty and pivot into the pain. If you come to a part of a book that you wish to dismiss, you may wish to actually slow down and start asking questions. Why has the writer created this effect? Why are they doing this? How does this tie in to their message? And you can see that there's some self-talk going on in my copy of Moby Dick when we get to chapter 1. And I'm telling myself to think back to the last significant journey that I took, a metaphorical journey, yeah, a moment of self-development and growth. I'm prompting myself to think back to that and to analyze the commonalities between my story and Ishmael's story. And we're always telling ourselves stories, yeah, about who we are, what the world is, what our purpose is. And so it's interesting, when we're trying to unravel these stories, what we're actually doing is thinking through our own story, our own self-talk. And of course, there's more frivolous marginalia here. Not everything has to be profound, and indeed insights come from frivolity. You should remove the inner editor, the censor. They are not your friend when you are playing. They're there to clean things up once you have already experimented and poured your ideas forth. So out of frivolity comes insight. But here I've just marked in the margin poetry because I love the opening. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. You can see I'm also trying to do some cross-pollination. Yeah, I'm trying to bring other writers into the conversation. So you're reading Melville, for example, but who naturally joins that conversation? You are the mediator, yeah? So here I've brought in Coleridge, that's Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And indeed on the next page you can see I've brought in Marcus Aurelius, you can see that I've brought in Freud because I've made a note, ego, superego, id, that's Freud. I've brought in Shakespeare, I've written all the world's a stage, that's a reference to Jacques in As You Like It, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, and one man in his time plays many parts. Elsewhere, I've brought in Wallace Stevens. I've also started scribbling scriptural references in the margins because Melville, like many great writers, is very elusive. There are plenty of biblical allusions throughout Moby Dick. So I've just put here Luke 16:19. And of course, you can see I'm underlining rather liberally. So that's Marginalia, and we can talk more in depth about Marginalia if you're interested, but our next stage in our journaling practice is rereading. They're all linked. Marginalia is linked to rereading, rereading is linked to journaling. You want to use your Marginalia as a scaffold or a direction, a map to direct your rereading. Good reading is rereading. Our first reading is certainly not our last reading unless the work is not very good. What does it say about a work if you simply want to steam through it and then put it back on the shelf and say, done? The great works are those works where we are never finished. We will never say, oh, I've read that book. We will say, I'm reading it, or I'm rereading it. Yeah, reading is something that we are always doing, even if we do not have the book in front of us. And our journaling, our marginalia, is a mnemonic that helps us remember and commit things to memory. And so when we're out in the world, we're walking around, we're talking to other people, we're dealing with problems, we are reading as well. And this is what I mean when I say live the great books. So if you're reading really cognitively challenging non-fiction, you want to spend a lot of time over everything. One of the most rewarding readings I've ever done in my life was when I took Aristotle's Ethics to a cafe in Vienna. I was living in Vienna at the time. I took it to a cafe in the morning every day for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I spent a couple of hours there and I nursed some double espressos and I wrestled with every word and laboured over every single page, and I broke that book down until I possessed it. And that kind of reading is work, but it's also the kind of work that is love made visible, to paraphrase Khalil Gibran. I would do that and then I would go on a little walk around the grounds of Schönbrunn Palace and I would digest everything that I had just read. It was a very, very rewarding thing to do, and there's no way I would have been afforded the self-growth that came during that year if I had attempted to speed read through Aristotle. You do not speed read Aristotle. You read very, very slowly and you think everything through. But with imaginative literature, your first reading, you might want to immerse yourself, yeah? And your marginalia might just be very, very light. Yeah, it could just look like a little star in the margin, underlining here, a circling there, but essentially you want to see everything. Flex those imaginative powers, because imagination is connected to empathy and morality. And so when we're reading imaginative literature, we want to see everything, hear everything, smell the smells, interact with the characters, befriend them. They are your friends and they are real people. And so you're just jotting in the margins. But then the rereading happens. Set yourself a milestone, yeah? Say to yourself you're going to read X number of pages. It could be 10 pages. And I'm a huge proponent for minimal effective dose. I love having a 1-page prescription every day, because it doesn't matter how tired you are. If that book is on your bedside, you can reach for it, and it's an easy win if all you have to do is read 1 page, and that 1 page typically will turn into multiple, 10, 20. But once you've hit your milestone, maybe you're reading for half an hour, you want to bake your rereading in by virtue of your marginalia. When you finish up for the day, or you're about to put your book down, go back over what you've just read and pay attention, more close care and attention, to the passages that you have marked. And the more sleep cycles we introduce, the more powerful our rereading becomes. Just say you have a page allotment for the week of 50, 60, 70 pages, whatever it might be. 5 chapters. We want to be just outside our comfort zones, yeah? Not too difficult. We don't want to set goals that are unachievable. But every day, when you read on, just say you're reading 10 pages a day, reread everything that's come before. And if you do that, by the time you get to the end of the week, there are some sections that you have really reread. You know them so well, and rereading in this fashion does not look like A to B. It might just look like skimming. It might just look like refreshing your memory. It might look like flipping the pages for 10, 20, 30 seconds. It might look like lingering on your favourite bit and just having a little think. Why did I like that? And you do that every single day until you come to the end of the week, where you have scheduled in ahead of time some journaling. You need to schedule these things. When I begin my week, I schedule 2 things before everything else. I schedule my reading and I schedule my physical activity. And the body and mind are intertwined. I will very often go on a walk and deliberately think about what I have read recently, and therefore make these writers my walking companions. And so you are creating really powerful habits, you're scaffolding really healthy habits onto one another, you're taking advantage of that blood flow, that oxygen, you're stepping away from the digital for a moment. I love the digital world when it is used appropriately, when we curate our digital world with illuminating podcasts and lectures and documentaries, great films and music. But it can also be a degenerative realm as well. And sometimes we need to engage with the analog, paper and pen, and the real analog, our soul in the world. And so all of this rereading is kind of like a spaced repetition technique. Those of you who have learnt a language likely know what an SRS is. That's a spaced repetition system, like Anki, where you put in your vocabulary or you put in the grammar that you want to drill and learn, and you do a drill every day, every other day, but you will be prompted at the appropriate time to revise things just before they leave your memory. So it's not exactly the same, but it does still serve as a powerful mnemonic. There's that adage of drillers being killers, yeah? And we have that idea, I think maybe Bruce Lee said something to the effect of, I do not fear the man who knows 1,000 kicks, I fear the man who knows 1 kick, but has drilled it 1,000 times. The same sentiment is true when it comes to the great books. We want to reread and focus in on those passages that really resonated with us. And another reason why rereading is beneficial is because it plugs into that idea of reflecting your change. We are always changing. We're always in flux and the world is always changing. It's unhealthy to not change. There is no such thing as stasis, but there is such a thing as entropy and degeneration. If we do not keep changing, we degrade, we decay. But change is also painful, and it can be a challenge at times to change. And we change by adopting new habits and discarding with old habits that do not serve us. And so as you're reading these books, you're collecting things that will aid you as you forge valiantly forward on the hero's journey that is your life. You're collecting themes, you're befriending characters, you're collecting pithy maxims and phrases that you can utilize as mantras in times of need. You're collecting words and ideas. And all of this becomes more robust. Your understanding of all of these things deepens with every rereading because you are bringing the changes that have taken place in the world and have taken place in you back to these books. And that's why it's so extraordinary to read Shakespeare as a teenager. Yeah, we read Shakespeare in school, and school does not do a very good job at teaching Shakespeare. And many of us leave school thinking, wow, I am never reading him again. But the thing is, we can't understand Macbeth or King Lear. We can't understand any of that at such a young age, but we still want that initial reading by virtue of being able to mark the growth later down the line. Years later, we come to Macbeth and King Lear, and we think, wow, I get it. I get it now. That's rereading. So, how do I journal? Let's talk about my approach. The tools of the trade are very simple, they're straightforward, they're easy to obtain. They look like a set of Muji pens. I love these little pens. I first came across these in a convenience store when I was living in Tokyo, and I found that these are brilliant pens for marginalia and journaling. And it looks like a bullet journal with graph paper, dotted paper, from the Leuchtturm 1917 range, which looks like this. Now, every journal, like every book and every person, is different and unique. And I have different journals for different purposes, and that's something that I would encourage you to do too. This one here is my sonnets journal. I've actually had many sonnets journals during my time. Every few years, I like to go through the sonnets of William Shakespeare in sequence and treat them as Rorschach tests, and just treat them as an opportunity for a little bit of reflection, a little bit of me time, a little bit of therapy. I'll put the date at the top of the page, I'll put the sonnet number, and I've done marginalia in the margins for the sonnet in question, and I just riff on the different themes. This one here doesn't have the date in the margins, but it is quite old, and I know that this is from a while ago because my handwriting is actually somewhat legible. It's quite neat. It seems as though the older I get, the more illegible my handwriting becomes. And you can see I've started by just making a list of the parts of that first sonnet that leap out to me. I don't immediately need to know why. I just need to get the ones that do leap out at me down on paper, and then we'll see what comes of it. You just get into the habit of writing. You just need to get the ink flowing. It's like with exercise. You want to get the blood flowing. You want to feel the ink coming out of your pen. Just get used to writing. Indeed, before I sit down to make a video or do a lecture or a podcast, I start talking for a little bit before I turn on the camera or the microphone. I just get into the habit of talking. And so you can see I've made a list of words, and then I have asked myself a question. I've basically said, which of these parts of the sonnet most leaps out at me? I find this to be a very good orienting question because the one contains the many and the many contains the one. I love that Buddhist tenet. It's such a great guiding principle. Rather than get bogged down and try to talk about absolutely everything, try to be selective, yeah? You want to curate your life. Be selective. Force selectivity upon yourself. Pick the one thing that resonates most with you. That's also a powerful mnemonic because whilst you're thinking about that one thing, everything else falls into place. You start to understand the work as a whole. In this case, it's a sonnet. And I'm not doing anything particularly special here. I've just written out a quote. Feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel. And like a child doing a homework assignment, I've just written, I think I like this because, and I just start meditating on the page. What I really love to do with my journaling is to pick one quote for the session. Now, I will journal every Sunday or every other Sunday, and I'll typically do that for 15 or 20 minutes. And I'll begin by rifling through what I've read that week, and I will alight upon one thing that resonates the most with me. And so if you've been rereading and constantly returning, you'll find that the thing that resonates most with you might change. It might deepen by virtue of the lived experience you've had over the course of the week or the last few weeks or the last month. Pick one thing, and for 15 minutes, you will write around that thing. So you'll write on the page, and then you'll think on paper. And you begin thinking by asking questions, and the questions can be quite simply, why does this strike me? Or you can take key words. If the writer is talking about war, we'll just try to define things, yeah? What is war? War is ... Yeah, you can make a list. What is love? Well, there's different kinds of love. You go through the love that you've experienced in your life, you try to qualify it, you try to understand it, get inside it. So, step one. Alight upon resonance with a quote that means something to you. It could be, kings are the slaves of history. That's from Tolstoy's War and Peace. We're alighting upon resonance. It could be every life is many days. Day after day, we walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. That's James Joyce from Joyce's Ulysses. So that's step one, alight upon resonance. Step two is to write the quote out. Feel the ink coming out of your pen. Ground yourself in the present moment and play pretend. You are James Joyce. You are Leo Tolstoy. Helen Vendler, one of my favourite exegetes when it comes to Shakespeare and Keats and Emily Dickinson. In order to become an authority on these poets, she told herself that she needed to commit the works to memory. And she did this by writing the works out by hand. And she questioned every single word. Why did the poet use this word and not a proliferation of other potential words? And she found that this was a powerful way to commit the poetry to memory and to understand what the poet was feeling and trying to convey when they wrote it. So that's what we're doing. Find the quote, write it out. And step three, pose questions to yourself and then just continue asking questions. Bring in other writers, bring in insights from your day-to-day life, bring in autobiographical meditations and musings, and be like a jazz musician, riffing on a theme. Great literature is simply riffing on a handful of themes. We don't read these great books because they're necessarily always teaching us something new. Part of the joy is seeing how different writers convey the same message. And again, when you're writing, remove the editor. Yeah, this is not for other people. So be as silly and frivolous, make mistakes, get it wrong, question yourself in the act and simply write and write without a filter. You are explicating the quote. Free association style. And keep that idea from Rilke in mind. Learn to love the questions. What you're doing with your journaling is you're taking the scenic route through great literature and through your life. It's not about the destination. It's a cliche, but it's true. We always look back with fond memories on the journey, so relish the journey. And every book is an opportunity for a new journey, and you can take many journeys. So you don't just want one journal, you want to have several. And there's such joy in flipping back through your journal a couple of months on and reading what you wrote about the taming of the shrew, reading what you wrote about Titus Andronicus. And when you're engaging with these great books, you're ultimately always engaging with yourself. It doesn't matter if what you're reading is not about your actual life. It is. If you are a gardener, then reading Tolstoy, even though what he's writing isn't ostensibly about gardening, will teach you something about your profession and your vocation. If you are a scientist, if you are a fighter, if you are a doctor, a teacher, a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, a mechanic, a carpenter, whatever your life looks like, you're always learning something about it through these great books, even if the topic isn't ostensibly about your vocation and your situation. And that's why it's good to put the date in the margins, because we do not get these insights and impressions in isolation. Your life is the fertile soil necessary to explicate them. So let's talk action steps and philosophy and how to practically apply it. The first thing you want to do right now is to schedule some journaling time for yourself. If you do not have a journal, then that's stage one. Get yourself a journal. Carve out some dedicated time. Look ahead. Look at your calendar and fit it in. I find that if we do not schedule things, then they do not happen. And keep in mind the Aristotelian idea of us being what we repeatedly do. Habit creation can take a little while, so it might be uncomfortable at first. We might be really, really excited, and then we might abandon it in about a month. It takes about 2 months, roughly. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less for some people, but around 2 months to firmly establish a habit. And so you want to be consistent, because you will get to a point where it will feel strange if you're not journaling at a certain time. It will feel strange if you're not doing marginalia. The best way I have found to establish a new positive habit is to scaffold it onto pre-existing habits. If you have your coffee in the morning, have your journal and pen or the big read you're trying to breach near where you store your beans, where your cafetiere sits, where your coffee or tea making apparatus lives. And that'll be a reminder to reinforce that habit. Another mindset is to treat this seriously. It's work. Work, of course, as we've said, is love made visible. Khalil Gibran said that, but it's work. And we designate meaning. We designate what is meaningful. And so what would your journaling look like if it were a meaningful activity, if it had a very strong knock-on effect for the world around you? Because it does. It can. It most certainly can. Many people might find themselves, understandably, from time to time, questioning whether there is any meaning at all in the world. Well, we designate it. And if we can designate it, then there is a sense of meaning. We are the masters of our fate. We are the captains of our soul, to quote Invictus. And so if your journaling is work and it's meaningful, then it might look like you carving out specific time on a specific day and sitting in a specified location, sitting at a table with a pen in your hand, sitting with good posture and attentive. And the fantastic thing about creating new habits isn't just because of what the habit can give us or what it can lead to in and of itself, but very often we need to swap out bad habits. If we're doing one thing, we can't be doing another. And so whilst we're journaling, whilst we're thinking about the great themes of the human condition, what are we not doing? Well, we're not doom scrolling through social media. We're not feeling riled up and struck with anxiety, struck with fear and depression, thanks to the news cycles. We're not arguing with people. What I love to do when I journal is I put my phone on airplane mode, and I like to go for a little walk, claim a little bit of stillness, and then sit down and treat it as a little bit of self-care. And there's always something to look forward to because there are multiple journals. And if there are multiple journals waiting on your shelf to be filled in, then there are multiple conversations. I have a short story journal. I have a Shakespeare journal. I have journals dedicated to specific poets like Shelley and Keats. I have topic-specific journals. Journals on Gothic literature. Journals on tragedy, tragic drama generally. And each of these journals contains something of my soul. And so that's how I personally approach my marginalia, my rereading, and my journaling practice. Let us know. What is the first thing you're going to journal on? What are you going to dedicate your journal to? What are you going to start writing about? What great books are you reading right now? What great writers do you intend to enter a conversation with? Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading and happy journaling, everybody. Bye-bye for now.